This is Lisa Spar. I'm the Assistant Director for Reference and Instruction. This is a repeat webcast for Professor Charlo's class on selected problems in law reform with an emphasis on education law. Professor Charlo had asked me to present research strategies for legislative and regulatory history and tracking, looking specifically at the annual professional performance review. So let's get started. First, we're going to review basically legislation and regulations, so we're all on the same page. This should all be a review for everybody that you've looked at before. And what we're looking at here is a handout on sources of the law, and we're going to be focusing, of course, on the legislative and the executive branches and how those processes occur. Again, this is just a basic review. So, of course, and we're going to focus on New York since that is the area that Professor Charlo is focusing on in her class. So, of course, in New York, we have the two houses of the legislature in the legislative branch, the Assembly and the Senate. And then when they work through the process of legislation, which you have read about in your materials provided by Professor Charlo, ultimately, if the Assembly and Senate agree, they pass the legislation. If that legislation gets signed by the governor, that legislation becomes a chapter law. Chapter law is what we call in New York, again, the law passed by the legislature, signed by the governor. The generic name for that in any jurisdiction in other states as well as federal is a session law. So, for instance, in Connecticut, they call their session laws public acts. On the federal realm in Congress, they call them public laws. But here in New York, you want to know the name chapter law. And so that chapter law is a statute. It's a piece of legislation. What happens to that legislation is it gets put into a subject arrangement, so we can find laws on, say, education, on family law, on tax, and that subject arrangement is called a code. And the other thing you want to really focus on when you're know about when you're looking at the code is that it is the legislation that's currently in force. So, of course, the Assembly and Senate have been passing legislation for many, many years. What you want to know is what the law is today. And to know what the law is today, you are going to look at the code for your specific jurisdiction. Here in New York, the code that most attorneys use is McKinney's. Okay, so that is the legislative branch here in New York. What happens, though, is that the legislature is not necessarily expert in every area of the law. So the legislators may not be education experts, they may not be tax experts, they may not be environment experts. So what the legislatures may do in any particular piece of legislation is they may say, okay, we have the general idea here. So in our example, we want to have annual professional performance review, but what's going to be the process? Who's going to be subject to the review? How are we going to change these over time? So the legislature, in the legislation that they pass, may delegate their legislative authority to a relevant agency within the jurisdiction. So we're talking about New York State, so the New York legislature may delegate its authorities to the various New York State agencies. Another reason delegation might happen, which may be particularly relevant for our area of professional performance reviews, is the legislature, in passing legislation, may also, for political reasons, not want to spell out the details because it might be too controversial or they don't want to be held politically accountable. Lots of other reasons. Again, you'll read about them in some of your materials. So again, the legislature may essentially punt and say to the agencies, hey, agency, you figure out the details. So what happens is the agencies then go through the process as laid forth in the State Administrative Performance Act, SAPA, and the state will promulgate regulations. Once these regulations are finalized, they're of course initially proposed to go through the SAPA process and then they get finalized, they will appear, the finalized regulations again will appear in a subject arrangement in a code, and here in New York we call our code the official compilation of codes, rules, and regulations of the state of New York. As you can say here, nobody remembers that whole name. What people remember is the NYCRR. One thing you want to remember about the NYCRR, because a lot of people do get confused by the NYC part, is we're not talking about New York City. We're talking about the New York Code rules and regulations, so don't get confused. And these regulations, as I mentioned, they start out as proposed regulations, and when they're finalized, they're put in the NYCRR, but when they're initially proposed, they appear in a publication called the New York State Register. And that New York State Register, by the way, is published every week. And we'll be looking more at that a little bit later when we talk about regulatory materials. Okay, so that essentially is the difference between statutes and regulations and how they interact with one another. So let's take a look at finding these various code sections, both the statutory code and the regulatory code. And for that, I am going to look at Westlaw. And if you are looking for a particular code section, that's pretty easy, especially on Westlaw. Westlaw is really great about just guessing. You can type in NY, since we already know the section from Professor Charlo, we could type in NY EDUC 3102-C. The other nice thing about Westlaw, if you do have a code section, which I always like to point out to people because it does make life easy if you can't guess the format for the code section. For each and every state, Westlaw has this statutory template, so I navigate to New York and statutes. And what you'll see on the side here is this wonderful find template. So again, if you can't figure out how to abbreviate the various code names in New York, whether it's education code or general obligations or any other code, you can go to this template here and you can pop in your section 3012-C. And Westlaw brings you right there. Now for this class, you probably will be working mostly with the code sections you already know about, but of course there may be other code sections you don't know about, or certainly other research projects where you don't know the section yet, and that of course you do a term search for that. Now in this instance, we're very lucky. We already have the necessary terminology, so that's going to be really easy for us to find in New York, but we may not know what the annual professional performance review is called in other states. So again, we're just going to want to do, perhaps we want to look for teacher evaluation as a more general term. Half the battle in research is finding the correct terminology. So we have had that done for us by Professor Charlo in giving us both the section numbers as well as the fact that it's called Annual Professional Performance Review. But if we don't know that terminology, then we have to do our best to guess. So in doing our regular search, we look here for teacher evaluation. We can narrow by statutes, and we can see some other statutes on this particular topic. And perhaps but you want to be creative on the terminology that you use. Another thing you want to do for both, and this is true for both legislation and regulations, in addition to doing the term search, if we go back here and we find a good code section, and we're back here at 3012-C, here in New York, when you're using codes, whether it's legislative code, statutes, or regulations, always look at the table of contents because a code is subject to range. So there may be other sections around your section that might be relevant for your issue. So we know that 3012-C and D are relevant, but perhaps some of these other sections may address some issues that come up with regard to your research. And again, this is really critical to do anytime you're doing any kind of statutory or regulatory research. Okay, so that's a little bit on how to find sections with or without the citation. So let's dive into the subject of today, and that is legislative history, regulatory history, and legislative tracking and regulatory tracking. What is legislative history or regulatory history? Basically, what we're looking when we're looking at either legislative or regulatory history is we're looking in the past. History, right, is the past. So you're looking back, and you're looking back to find reasons for enactment. What are the laws and regulations meant to accomplish? Perhaps you want to get a sense of what either the legislature or the regulator meant by particular language in the statute or regulation. So we look back to the process of regulation and legislation to see what documents were produced to help us find what this intent was, to find what the reasons for enactment was. Contrast that with tracking, either bill tracking or regulation tracking, and you're essentially looking forward. You're looking what's going to happen to this particular section moving forward in the future. Have there been any proposed changes? What is the status of these various proposals for changes in either the legislation or the regulation? So history looks backward, tracking looks forward. Okay, so let's finally dive in and talk a little bit about legislative history. So we're talking about the statutes, we're talking about the Assembly and Senate, pass the measure, signed by the governor, it becomes a chapter law. So what we're going to look at now is the video recommended by Professor Charlo in her materials that actually is really great for understanding the legislative process. Now, this describes the federal process, and it's very simplistic. It doesn't describe everything, but I think it will help us understand the legislative process and then how to find the documents produced in this process for legislative history. And it's kind of fun, too.
Whew, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." And he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so as I said, that's a simplified version of the process. So let's talk about how that applies to New York. So the documents that are produced in New York are much different, are somewhat different than on the federal level. So for instance, as we already saw in New York, they're called chapter laws. When our bill finally becomes a law, instead of law, it would be chapter law on the forehead. Another difference you saw you saw in your readings, there were some of the critiques from the Brennan Center having to do with committees, the infrequency of conference committees, the role of the leaders, the fact that the committees don't produce a report very frequently, if at all. On the federal level, that's not true. So we have many fewer documents to find for legislative history in order to get a sense of, again, the intent about the rationale for the law. But here is a good example of the process in New York you can get. So here is a bill that was introduced in 2016. S stands for Senate and the number. So it's referred to the Finance Committee. You can see it was amended there. Gets different numbers as it's, or different letter designations as it's amended. And again, you can get more detail in your readings. And then it eventually passed the Senate and it was delivered to the Assembly. So remember, our bill got dragged to the other house. So the same thing happens in New York. It got referred to a committee within the Assembly. It was substituted. The Senate bill was substituted and used in the Assembly. And then it continued along the process till finally it was passed in the Assembly and delivered to the governor, who signed it, just like our law got signed, and it was assigned a chapter number, chapter 56, within 2016. Okay, so for legislative history, what we need to do is to find these various documents. And the way we do that in New York is basically we look for something called a bill jacket. Essentially, the governor pulls together some of the documents that exist, and he puts them into a bill jacket for that chapter law. And that's why understanding the chapter is key, and actually knowing the particular chapter law is key for doing legislative history research. So the way you find what chapters enacted your particular statute section is you start here at the statute section. So here we are back at 3012C. And the way you find the chapters is you go down to something called the credits. So I'm just scrolling on down. And at the bottom on Westlaw, you will see a section called credits. On Lexis, they call it history. So you have to be a little flexible in your terminology. And what we see here are essentially the credits for Section 3012C. And the credits are just which chapters either first enacted and then later amended Section 3012-C. So what we see here is 3012C was originally added by the laws of 2010. So in 2010, by chapter, that's what the C stands for, 103. And within chapter 103, our section was established in section 1, and all of this became effective in July 2010. And then we find out that this section was amended in 2012 by chapter 21, and within chapter 21 sections 1 through 11, and that was all effective in March. Now, sometimes you'll be lucky and you'll see the word amended, so that tells you what's going on, but you usually will not. So what tells you that there's been a change is that teeny little semicolon. So when you see that semicolon in the credit section, you should interpret that to mean and amended by. So we see the semicolon here, we think and amended by the laws of in 2012 again, so it was amended a couple of times in 2012, this time by Chapter 57, and these parts within Chapter 57. Then we look across and we see semicolons, so we think to ourselves, and amended by, and it was amended again in 2012 by a different chapter, Chapter 68, effective in July 2012. We see the semicolon and we think, and amended by, and turns out it's amended again in 2013 by Chapter 57 in 2013 in these particular sections. Semicolon, we think, and amended by, one more time in 2014 by Chapter 56. Semicolon, and amended by, one more time in 2015 by Chapter 56. So according to these credits, the last time our section was amended was in 2015 by Chapter 56 within the year 2015. Okay, so you might be thinking to myself, oh my goodness, do I really have to do legislative history research for all of those different chapters? And the answer is possibly, but hopefully not. And here is how you will determine which chapters you need to do research in order to understand the legislative history. You will want to look at the first chapter because that's what establishes the section. So that will pretty much give you, for the most part, the answer to the question, why was this section established? What was the law meant to accomplish? What was the reason for enactment? So you definitely want to look at the first one. So we will definitely want to look at the bill jacket. Remember, the bill jacket is where we find most legislative history materials. We'll want to look at the bill jacket for 2010, Chapter 103 in 2010. But what about all these amendments? All these different amendments affected different parts of the language of our section. How do we tell which, if any, we want to look? And the way you do that is you go up to the History tab here and you take a look at Editor and Reviser notes. And what these Editor and Reviser's notes tell us is that it tells us the chapter laws, which we already saw in the credits, and then it tells us what that chapter law did. So this particular chapter law provides, and it says Section 7A of this Act. So if this is language of interest, then we'll want to take a look at the legislative history for Chapter 57 in 2013, and likewise 2012. And these different chapter laws in 2012, the Editors and Revisers notes, tell us what they did. Now, interestingly, this isn't always the case, but in taking a look at Lexis, I went down to the history. Remember, on Lexis, it's called history, not credits. And after the history, I see editor's notes. So that's kind of like Westlaw editors and revisers notes. And for some reason, I honestly don't know the answer, Lexis goes into more detail for this particular section, 3012. So you can see what the different chapter laws did, and you see these amendment notes. So you can see that at least this particular chapter added subsection 2, paragraph K2, as well as K1 in 2013. This is what happened. So interestingly, Lexis goes into a little bit more detail. So for purposes of your research for this class in our sections, 3012C and 3012D, you might want to look at the history on Lexis. Okay, so we now know that we want to check at least the original chapter number, chapter 103 from 2010. Remember, that's the chapter that enacted our section. We saw that in the credits on Westlaw as well. And I mentioned a little bit ago that in New York, we have something called a bill jacket that pulls together many of the documents. So I'm going back to Westlaw here. And again, we're back here at 3012C. And to find bill jackets, the first place I would look is on Westlaw. And Westlaw is better for bill jackets than Lexis. Lexis might have been a little bit better in giving us descriptions of the chapters, but if you're looking for bill jackets, I recommend Westlaw. And I go again to this history tab, and instead of Editors and Advisors Notes where we just were, I'm going to go down to legislative history materials. Now, whatever bill jackets Westlaw has available for the various different chapters will be here. So we look through, we see vote records, which may or may not be of interest depending if you're following a particular legislator's voting. If you scroll down, there are not too many bill jackets, but fortunately for us in this instance, here's one bill jacket, and it turns out it's definitely the chapter we want to look for because it's under Chapter 103, which again is the enacting chapter, so we definitely want to look at the legislative history for that. So we do have a bill jacket for that. So let's take a look at a bill jacket. Open that up. And again, the governor just collects, a whole bunch of different types of documents. So we have something from the executive chamber, and it looks like the governor, this is a message from the governor, might be the governor's message why he's deciding to sign this piece of legislation. We have the voting, floor votes. We have again another message from the executive chamber to the Senate. And probably the most useful document in legislative history for New York are going to be the various memoranda. And this one is the memorandum in support by the sponsor, and it talks about the purpose or general idea of the bill. And then it gives you a summary of the specific provisions. So here we're going to get an idea of why this measure was enacted. And it's actually, in this case, pretty extensive. You won't always find that for legislative history. See, here's a justification as well. So you'll definitely want to read this memoranda and other memoranda like it within the bill jacket. Now, we noticed looking at Westlaw that we only found one bill jacket for all of the different chapter laws. Westlaw is not the only source for bill jackets. There's actually a source on the web for free at the New York State Library. The link to this is on your handout, and I give you the web address there. You can also find it, honestly, just by Googling New York State bill jackets. You'll want to go to the digital collections, and here we see a listing of the years that are available in the New York State Library. So it goes back to 1995 through only 2013, unfortunately, so we don't have more recent bill jackets yet. If you need to find a bill jacket that's not on Westlaw or here at the New York State Library, come see us at the reference desk and we'll do our best to track it down for you, although that will take some time. So just be prepared to plan ahead if you do need a bill jacket that's not available online. Okay. So one other aspect you want to check for legislative history that is available online that's not in the bill jacket is going back to our section. And you can get at this a number of ways. You actually want to take a look at the chapter itself, the session law itself, not just the documents that were prepared in considering the section, but we want to go to Chapter 103. And that's pretty easy on Lexis or Westlaw, because in the credits or the history, they give you the link. And the reason you want to do that is some session laws, not all, will actually have a section in the beginning indicating purpose or legislative intent. Now, in looking at our Chapter 103, this doesn't appear to have such a section, unfortunately. You'll want to check that for 3012D and any other session laws, any other statutory sections. You'll want to check the session law enacting, and if you're looking at any of the amending session laws, you'll want to check those session laws as well to see if there are sections within the session law that talk about legislative intent or purpose. Okay. In addition to these sources, there are a couple of other sources you'll want to check that are in print in the library in the reading room right near the reference desk, so they're really easy to get to. There's McKinney's Session Laws, We've already looked at the actual session laws, but McKinney's session laws come in 2 volumes, and the first volume has for each year, and for each year the first volume has the session laws, and the second volume has some memoranda. Sometimes the memoranda you find in McKinney's session laws will duplicate what you see in the bill jacket, but sometimes they don't, so you might find additional memoranda in McKinney's session laws in the library in print. Another resource is called the New York Legislative Annual, also in print, also near the reference desk, and again, that may have memoranda that you don't find elsewhere. Both of these sources are really easy to use as long as you have the year and the chapter number. So you want to look at chapter 103, you'd go to the volume for 2010 and look at both volumes for McKinney's session laws, and then look at the 2010 volume for New York Legislative Annual. Okay. For the most part, we will now have covered all of the materials available for legislative history. There are some pieces of legislation that also have legislative reports or reports from the New York Law Revision Commission. And on your handout, under legislative history, item number 3, you see these referenced. Those reports tend to be issued for major revisions of codes like the CPLR or the Criminal Procedure Code, or perhaps the Tax Code. You will not find these reports, you will not find these reports for every single section. Most of the time you won't find these reports for a particular section. But if you need to be complete, which you should be, to double check, you would look again back in McKinney's. So actually, I'm going to just go back to our section 3012. And again, you would look in the editor's and reviser's notes. And if there was a legislative report, they would usually list it here. Another place you can look for these reports is online at the Assembly and Senate websites. So here's the Assembly site, and there's a section for legislative reports. So that's really easy. Here's the Senate website. That's a little more difficult to find because, as you can see, there's no direct link for reports. So what I'm going to show you is actually a Google search trick that you can not only use for legislative history research, but for any website you look at. So I'm using Chrome, the browser Chrome here, and in the browser Chrome, this web address bar also searches as my search bar. So this is like a Google search right here. So if I want to search the NewYorkSenate.gov website for reports, I'm going to tell Google that I'm going to use the word site, S-I-T-E, colon, then I'm going to have my web address right here, no spaces. Then after my web address, I am going to put a space, and I'm going to type in whatever word I want to search for. So in this case, reports. And here you see a listing, and all of these results you can see are in that NewYorkSenate.gov website. And here's a listing of the search results, and you can see that there are some reports. I would then want to look to see if these reports have anything to do with the APPR, or I could add APPR to my search up here. This is a really, really nifty and useful trick, as I said, for doing any kind of search of a particular website using Google. And again, you can see that the search string here, SITE colon, whatever web address it is that you want to search, and then a space, and then whatever search terms you want to use. Okay. You can see on your handout the link to the New York Law Revision Commission. That's where you would go to see if there are any reports issued by that body. Again, that's very unusual. And there are Senate and Assembly journals, the events that go on there, and those are available in print. And if you need help with those, come to the reference desk. It's unusual that you're going to find anything useful in them with regard to legislative history, but if you really need to do totally complete research, they are available. Okay, that is it for legislative history research. Let's now talk about bill tracking. So how do we track a particular if there are any changes in our APPR sections, and then if there are changes proposed, how do we track what's happening currently with those changes? Again, more looking forward. Once again, I'm going to come back here to Westlaw and go back to our section. And Westlaw and Lexis, as I'll show you in a moment, make it really easy, because all you need to do is take a look and see what signals Westlaw and Lexis give us. So for instance, Westlaw here is saying, hey look, there's proposed legislation. And you just need to click on that flag. And Westlaw lists for us a whole bunch of different bills that have been introduced in the Assembly and Senate. And you can tell by the abbreviation, AB is Assembly and SB is Senate. And you could take a look at the text of these bills by clicking on these links. And again, as promised here on Lexis, go back up to the top. And you can see here on the right, there's pending legislation. So pretty easy to check a particular section and see if there's been anything proposed. Now, another question that comes up, okay, you're looking into law reform for this entire semester. You don't want to have to come back every day to see if there's any changes and check the list and compare it to yesterday's list. You want to just find out if anything new gets proposed. And again, Lexis and Westlaw make that extraordinarily easy by allowing you to set up alerts. And the little bell symbol, and that's actually the same on both Lexis and Westlaw, allows you to create an alert. What I'm going to do is show you my list of alerts on Lexis that I've already created for this topic. And yes, that is annual professional performance review. I'll go back to that alert in a moment. But I've set up an alert. I just clicked on that bell and walked through the process for our different sections. And now Lexis will send me an email if there are any changes to those sections. The reason I also have the term search is, okay, I'm tracking sections 3012C and D here. What if there's a new section that gets proposed? So I have done a term search for, since we know our terminology, annual professional performance review. And actually, I have a couple of different searches here. You don't have to do it in 2 searches. You can do it in 1. And what I'm searching is, when I set up my alert, it gives me an opportunity to choose the sources. So I'm searching Legal News New York Law Journal, which is a great resource to search because that's going to tell you what's going on in New York law. And I should mention that the New York Law Journal is only searchable and available on Lexis. So that's one reason why you might want to set up this similar alert on Lexis to track anything that's going on in the news about the annual professional performance review, not necessarily just changes in a statute section. And I'm searching legal news generally, although probably it would appear New York Law Journal. And in this other alert, again, you can do it in 1 alert or more. I'm also tracking codes and regulation. So here you see the regulation tracking, and I also have an alert for code tracking as well. And again, you set that up just walking through the alert. And did the same thing on Westlaw. Just to be complete, I'm not sure you really need them on both systems. Again, I set up the alerts for the sections themselves, and you can see that. And I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. You can see that I've set up the regulation tracking works exactly the same way. And I also set up a term search for Westlaw. I named the search APPR. My search terms I spelled out. And here again, you can see I've done regulation tracking, statute tracking. I don't have any news tracking because I think the New York Law Journal is enough, but you might want to add the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Again, both of those are on Lexis rather than Westlaw. So here on Westlaw, I pretty much just have the tracking for legislation and regulations. So that's how you would keep track if there are any changes proposed. So imagine now you find, oh, hey, look, there were all these bills that we saw on Westlaw when we clicked on proposed legislation. Here's a list of all these bills. Maybe we want to see what's happening with these bills now. And we've actually already seen the site where we can do that. Now you can do that on Lexis and Westlaw. I personally don't like their bill tracking. I find it more confusing. So that's why I like to go back to this site. And again, this is the LegInfo site at New York. The link is on your handout. And I can see what the status is of any particular bills. So if one of the bills we saw listed was S5954. So I enter in it's the bill that was introduced in 2016. And you can see the results here. So I've just checked off status up here. So this is very basic bill tracking. What's happened to this bill? It got referred to rules, it got to a third reading, it passed the Senate, it got delivered to the Assembly, and then it died in the Assembly. So right now, and then it got returned back to the Senate, referred to the Finance Committee in the Senate, and so this is where it stands now. If I wanted to take a look at the text, or a summary, or if there are any memoranda or voting, I could click off these options and redo my search and get that information as well. And as you can see, far more extensive results. So that's essentially bill tracking as well as setting up alerts. The last thing you might want to check, since you're following this semester, and it's actually kind of a cool feature, so it's fun to show, here on the New York State Assembly website, if you scroll down, you can also search for bills and get bill tracking here, and that link is on your handout as well. But where I'm going is actually to take a look at live coverage of legislative proceedings to see what's going on in the Assembly these days. So we can watch live, we can see what upcoming events there are. Now, as I understand it, the Assembly is no longer meeting. They usually meet through June. It's possible they could be reconvened. I suggest you talk to Professor Charlo about how that all works and the details of how it actually works in practice rather than the theory. So we see upcoming events. There's a public hearing on water quality, so nothing of interest for us for APPR, but we now kind of know what's going on. And if we go back here, we can also look at archived committee hearings. So we could take a look and see if there are any archived hearings that might be of interest to us with regard to annual professional performance reviews, and scroll through there. Okay, so that is legislative history and legislative bill tracking. Let's now turn the page on the handout, or turn over the handout, to regulations. Again, the legislature delegates its authority to the agencies. In our case, since we're interested in education, the relevant agency is going to be the Department of Education. The Department of Education will have proposed rules. Those proposals will go through the administrative procedure as set forth in SAPA, as we talked about, and then finally the Department of Education will decide on final rules, and those proposed and final rules, all of which will be published in the New York Register. So how do we, if we are interested in any of that history, how do we find out where to look? Well, again, let's go to the sections that we already know about, because Professor Charlo pointed them out to us. And so there is 8 NYCRR 30-2.14 is one of them. Now, some of you may notice in the handout from Professor Charlo that she uses a different citation format. She's 8CRR-NY. We strongly recommend you use the NYCRR when you're typing into Westlaw, because that's the only format that Westlaw and Lexis recognize. They don't recognize the reversal. I know that's used, the reversal is used in other contexts, but if you can, remember to use the NYCRR format. Just a heads up to keep you from getting confused. And again, as we talked about, to find a regulatory section, you can type in the citation format. There's no nice template the way there is for statutes. And again, to find regulations on a particular subject, you do your terminology search. With regulations, it's even more critical to figure out what the standard terminology is used in your area. So we already know it's annual professional performance reviews, but if we were to do this research in other states, we would have to change our terminology because other states may not use that phrase. And again, also with regulations, remember to check the table of contents because you might find other relevant sections around the one that you already have. Okay, so to find out where we might want to research regulatory history, just like in statutes, we'll want to take a look at the credits. Unfortunately, the credits aren't quite as informative with regulations as they are with statutes. So what the credits do is it gives us basically just the dates where actions took place. So emergency rulemaking effective December 2015, that happened to have expired in 16, and then there's another emergency rulemaking in March of 2016. These are all dates. What they don't tell us is that these dates are referring to the New York State Register. Again, the New York State Register is where all of these proposed rules and final rules are published for New York agencies, as well as some other New York agency materials like notices and other types of documents. So it's really the register where we are going to look for any regulatory history. Thankfully, Westlaw makes this really easy. And I have to say, for New York regulations, I would stick with Westlaw. I find that Lexis isn't as complete yet. Perhaps they will catch up, but not quite yet. So here in Westlaw, we've got our regulations section we know we're interested in. And again, just like with statutes, we have a nice history section. Now notice we have history overview, we have validity and regulatory history. Some of you may have noticed, oh my goodness, we have a red flag. We all know that we absolutely, when we see a red flag, we better check it, right? There's an adopted regulation. So in taking a look at this red flag, because we always want to check out that red flag no matter what we notice here, again, that word validity and those two sections. So here are two sections from the New York Register. You actually kind of New York Register text, guess that that's what that stands for. And these are the same two sections that are in this history tab. So as we said, got to take a look at them. So let's click on the link. And what this first link is referring us to is within the New York Register on June of 2016, we see basically a change. This is an emergency rulemaking, so this is a change to our rule, and it lets us know which sections are affected, and these are the two sections we know we're interested in. I'm going to point out this ID number now. This is a complex regulatory section, as we'll see. So sometimes knowing this number is useful. If you don't need it, don't worry about it, but I'll point it out in case it is useful. And what we see here in the New York Register, which is great, is it's telling us the statutory authority. Remember, regulations are delegated authority, so what statute delegated that authority? It's telling us what the finding is for why we need this emergency rule, which is pretty generic, right? Preservation of general welfare, but it then goes into specific reasons for this finding of necessity. So again, it goes into the why was this regulation promulgated? What is this regulation meant to accomplish? What is its reason for promulgation? And so it gives us the purpose and a regulatory impact statement. So you'll want to read all this to get a sense of what the Department of Education was trying to accomplish with this particular rule change, or emergency rule adoption, in June of 2016, June of this year. So you can see there's actually quite a lot of information here. And as we scroll down, you'll notice in addition to the Department of Education indicating what it considered part of the rulemaking process is the public has an opportunity to comment. And what you find here in the New York Register is the Department of Education is listing these comments and its response to that comment. So in reading these, you very possibly could get a really good sense of what the rationale is, what the Department of Education's rationale is for promulgating this emergency rule. Okay, I'm going to click on back. And again, under that red flag, we want to check what's there. This other link is basically just the text of that emergency rule that was promulgated on June 1st. So we've checked out the red flag and got a sense a little bit of what was going on with our section, but if we want to check the regulatory history, we might want to look at the other aspects or the other documents that were produced. And again, these documents are all going to be in the New York State Register. So in taking a look at these, we'll get a sense of what else happened with this regulation in the past. And you can see we go as far back as when the rule was initially promulgated, as we saw in the credits in December of 2015, taking us forward up to as close to the present day as possible. And actually, speaking of that, you can tell how current Westlaw is, and this is true for both regulations and statutes, by scrolling down, and at the bottom of the section you will see a current with statement. So this is telling us this section is current with amendments in the New York State Register dated August 24th. So today is August 26th, so that's actually pretty current. And you'll have that current with statement for statute sections as well at the bottom. Okay, so another aspect of regulatory history is not really history, but what the department has in mind for implementing this regulation is, and it's actually very important, is regulatory guidance. So in addition to just indicating in the New York Register what the Department of Education had in mind in promulgating these regulations, the department and agency may also give you guidance in terms of how it intends to put into effect these regulations. And so here in the New York, and for this you need to go to the agency's website. So we're at the New York Education Department website. You can try to browse through, so we might want to look at policy and guidance. You can also search. I would actually suggest you do both. So let's start with the search, because we know that's going to be specific to our issue. And sure enough, we find guidance on New York's annual professional performance review. And I want to highlight something for you because I'm going to contrast it in just a moment. Notice we're still at the New York State Education Department website, nysed.gov. If we click on this guidance link, it gives us a listing of different guidance documents: guidance on education law 3012C, guidance on education 3012D, guidance sections, and commissioner's regulations. We're going to want to check out all of these. I'm not going to download them, but we're going to want to check out all of these. What I wanted to point out with the website is that when we clicked on that guidance link, we actually came to a different website. We're at a website now called Engage NY, and we can look up here at the address. It's Engage NY. It's no longer NYSED. So I want to be aware of what website I'm looking at, because I know the Department of Education is a New York State governmental agency. I don't know what Engage NY is. Is this an advocacy group? Do I need to be careful that they're going to present a particular point of view or argument for a particular aspect of APPR? So I'm going to want to check out this Engage NY, and I'll usually look for an About link or an FAQ. And in fact, I have that FAQ right here, and what I learned is Engage NY was created and is currently maintained by the New York State Education Department. Okay, so now I know it's not an advocacy group. It's actually just another arm of the New York State Education Department, so I have a sense of the reliability of my information. If you're looking on a website, you always have to keep in the middle of your mind, not even the back, how reliable is this information. So if this is coming from the New York State Department of Education, I know it's reliable, at least as far as what the New York Education Department is doing. Okay, and we can actually take a look. I did download that guidance document so you can see what it looks like. So guidance on New York State APPR, pretty updated, May of this year. Purpose of the guidance. You can see it's a 168-page document, so this is going to give us a lot of information. You may not want to look at all 168 pages, but here's a nice table of contents so you can pinpoint what might be of interest in this guidance on how the New York State Department of Education is going to implement its and apply its regulations. So you'll definitely want to be looking more in depth at this guidance document and those other guidance documents we saw on the website. And listed for you on the regulatory side of the handout, some other sites at Engage New York, or other pages, excuse me, at the Engage New York site that might be of interest. I can't promise you I have listed every single one of interest, so you'll want to, as I said, browse through that Engage New York website, looking at these other links to see what might be of interest here, as well as doing that on the New York State Education Department website. Okay, so that's essentially regulatory history and guidance. Let's take a look now at regulation tracking, which honestly we've kind of already done because it works exactly the same way pretty much as statutory tracking. So I'm going to come back here and find our section here on Westlaw, and sure enough, we have that little bell there, and I could set up a regulation tracking for that. And here in my alerts, we actually already saw it. Up here at the top, you can see my key site alert for regulation. And when I set up my search for the terms APPR, Annual Professional Performance Review, as we already saw, as the content that was searched, I also include regulation tracking in addition to statutory tracking. And here on moving over to Lexis, again, works the same way. Lexis, again, with regulations isn't quite as good, so you don't necessarily have the alert for the regulations the way you do for the statute sections, but you can still set up you can do a term search for Annual Professional Performance Review and set up regulation tracking as I did here. The last thing you can do if you really want to just cover your bases is set up something called a Google Alert. So here's Google, and what I'm going to do here actually is type in the address for Google Alerts, because this honestly is the easiest way I found to get to this service of Google. Google doesn't make it easy to find otherwise. Well, Google Alert is like a Lexis or Westlaw alert, but instead of just searching Lexis or Westlaw, a Google Alert will search Google. So you can do a search for Annual Professional Performance Review or really anything else of interest, and Google will deliver you results of that search. So I'm going to sign in real quickly here and show you some of my Google Alerts. Now, I didn't set up a Google Alert for So I did not set up a Google Alert for APPR, but I have other alerts set up. So I am going to now go back to that website. Like I said, Google doesn't make it easy to use these alerts anymore because Google's now featuring other new toys that Google has created, and the alerts is an old toy that's gathering dust under the bed. But it still works, and it's still really useful. So here you can see some Google Alerts that I've set up, and I get emails when Google finds a page that meets any of these terms. So a great way to track news as well. Okay, last on your handout are useful sites and concepts for regulatory research. So I give you some I give you a link to the New York Register if you want to look at it online. It is also searchable on Lexis and Westlaw, but you can view the PDF at the link that I have under number 2 here. Under number 1, I explain that regulation tracking number. It's very possible you'll never need to use this, but if you do, I at least found it useful to understand what this number means and what it's telling me, and then using this number to track the regulation for the APPR that we were looking at. Because again, it was pretty complex. There's a lot of emergency rulemaking going on, and this number was the one constant throughout. If you need help with that, by all means, come ask, come see me. And I haven't mentioned, for those of you in Professor Charlo's class, by all means, if you have any questions on any of this, please feel free and make sure to come see me. You can email me with questions. You can make an appointment with me. If you find me at the reference desk, that's great too. I'm definitely available. So I'd like to finish up with the video. And for those of you who are Jon Stewart and John Oliver fans, this actually, to me, gives a great illustration and explanation of some of the more political aspects to both statutes and regulations. And I thought that would be of particular interest for you, given that the APPR is certainly a very politically charged issue. And while this is talking about a different piece of legislation that's federal, not New York, I think a lot of the same ideas and concepts apply. And besides, Jon Stewart and John Oliver are just too much fun. How can you pass them up?
Now, with the standoff in our nation's capital over the debt ceiling showing us nothing but bitter stalemate, it's easy to forget that it was just 1 year ago that Washington actually got something done. The Dodd-Frank Act, a complete overhaul of the regulations governing our financial system, intended to ensure that we would never again suffer another 2008-style meltdown.
These reforms represent the strongest consumer financial protections in history. And these protections will be enforced by a new consumer watchdog with just one job: looking out for people, not big banks, not lenders, not investment houses, looking out for people.
What? Wait, who were we looking out for before? Anyway, the Dodd-Frank Act is now 1 year old. And here to discuss the effect it's having in reforming a damaged financial system, we're very lucky to have with us tonight H.R. 4173, the Dodd-Frank Act, everybody!
I am a law, a 2,000-page law. Congress passed me without one single flaw. I make sure Wall Street plays by the new regulations, protecting your investments across the entire nation.
Sorry, just hang on there 1 second.
What?
I'm sorry, Dodd-Frank.
Uh-huh. What?
What the hell happened to you?
What do you mean?
I don't want to say it, but you look like...
Oh, hey, easy. Washington's a tough town, John. Since getting past, yeah, I've taken a few shots, but I'm still standing. Yeah, yes, I'm still standing. I'm still here. In fact, just last week, my all-new Consumer Financial Protection Board opened for business. As soon as it gets a director, we'll be off to the races.
So wait, there's no director?
No, not just yet.
It's been a year.
Come on.
What about Elizabeth Warren? Wasn't she supposed to be the director of this thing? What happened there?
Confirmation in the Senate, there's no motion. Obama could have used a recess appointment to give her the job without a vote, but he didn't do it because his feelings weren't that strong.
Wow.
But you know what?
That's interesting.
You know what, John? It doesn't matter. I've still got 400 tough new rules to remake our broken and corrupt financial system.
Well, you know what? That's great. How are those new 400 rules working?
They're working great.
Regulations.
The ones that are written are working great.
The ones that are... How many of the 400 new rules have been written?
38. It's a magic number. Yes, it is. Oh, it's a magic number. It might not be 400 or 150 or 77, but it's 38. and that's a magic number. Let's do this. Red Sox pitcher Kurt Schilling, LA Clippers forward Dale Wilkinson, Cardinals tailback Reggie Renders, they want 38. And it's a magic number. Oh, it's a magic number.
But 38 is a magic number because Dale Wilkinson
Yeah.
makes it a magic number?
Yeah. You've heard of Dale Wilkinson?
No, I have not. The
Oh.
Clippers guy, until you mentioned him just now. No, I have not heard
You'll
of him.
just have to take my word for it. He definitely exists.
Why weren't the rules written, John?
Stickly. Lobby, 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 get your access here. Lobby, 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 get your access here. Lobby, lobby, that's your... Stop it, stop it, stop it, hold it, I can't do this. Blaming lobbyists is a cop-out, John. Here's what's going down. This whole financial reform thing is a sham. The only way the Congress would pass me was if the details of my rules and regulations were left unspecified, giving K Street lobbyists all the time they would need to water me down post-passage. And you know what? Exactly, boo, exactly. Thank you, boys and girls, thank you. And you know what? If any actual tough rule managed to squeak through, Congress people cut the budget of the agency responsible for enforcing it. The whole thing is a giant punt.
That's it for now. You can watch the remainder of it at home if you're interested. Thanks very much. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, and good luck.